Right. I know those of you watching the recording, you are normally um, used to the side by side. We do that, but today we're going to do full screen on the recording, both for the live and the recording on the YouTube, and you'll see why. We got some charts and things that are going to be easy to see if we're full screen. So today is our AMA. We're going to do Trump tariff talk. We're going to talk about tariffs, how they work, what they are, all that good stuff. Again, those of you who are live, just want to make sure I want to say it on the recording. Those of you who are live on Facebook, please drop comments in the chat there. If you are one of the folks who are joining me on Zoom today, you can uh, drop your comments and questions in the Zoom chat, and I will get to them as I'm able. But I wanted to use our AMA time today to talk about tariffs because that is the single biggest subject on which I'm getting questions right now, quite frankly. And so I just wanted to make sure that we answered all of those questions adequately. I'm getting questions on what tariffs are, how they work, how these tariffs work, what the implications are, what are the stated goals? Are we achieving them? Are we not? What's going to happen? So let's see what we have here. Let's do a basic primer on tariffs. So a tariff, just put very simply, is a tax imposed on imported goods. The tax is paid by the importing company. Often this is a special import company, though it might be a manufacturer or retailer doing the imports directly. Tariffs are not paid by foreign governments, they're just not. However, if a foreign company happens to be the importer, that foreign company will pay the tariff because it's the importing company. The import company then passes the cost of that tax along to the manufacturer, which passes it to the retailer, which passes it on to you. Now, typically, the consumer does not end up paying the entire cost of the tariff because we still have laws of supply and demand, and they can only charge so much for a product. But the consumer does end up paying some significant portion of it. So, really, a tariff is a tax that is paid by everyone along the supply chain in one form or another. Uh, as far as again, who pays? I am asked sometimes, do foreign companies cut the price they charge for what they're shipping to the US? And the answer is sometimes they do, if they're in a position to, if they can afford it. So, for example, in response to a 10% tariff, the foreign company might cut its prices by 10% in order to keep its products more competitive. Not every foreign company can afford to do that, but some are able to, and if they can, they do. Oh, do we have a? No, hang on. Sorry. Uh, there we go. And then I am also asked, why can't the US companies along the supply chain just eat the cost out of their profits? Why do they have to pass it along? Why can't they just eat it? They're making all these profits. And the answer is sometimes they can and do, especially in industries that have very high profit margins. So think of things like cell phones and tablets. The margin per unit is extremely high, meaning they can sometimes eat much of the cost of the tariff and still keep their prices relatively stable. So sometimes they will do that. They will eat the cost. Now they will still pass some of it along to consumers, but in a high margin industry where they have a high profit margin per unit they sell, the companies sometimes can eat the cost of the tariffs. But consider industries with low profit margins. Think of the actual importer, the company that actually pulls the good across the border or pulls it off the ship. The importer is earning very little per product or per unit they import. They cannot afford to just eat the cost or they lose money. Auto manufacturers, we think of these as high profit companies. In reality, they are low profit margin per car they sell. So it's hard to eat the cost. Retail and grocery stores. When you go to a retail store and a grocery store, their profit margin per unit you buy there is pretty low. So it's hard for them to eat the cost of that. And then a question I get is, hey, but Ian, aren't these companies, Walmart, GM, all them, aren't they earning massive profits? And the answer is yes, overall they are. They're earning billions in profits. But their profit per unit sold is not high. They are making money on volume sales. So think of it this way. If General Motors is only earning 5% per car they sell, but the tariffs are making the cars 25% more expensive. They cannot just eat 25% on that car, or they're losing money on each car they sell. So they have to pass along the cost, or they lose money on it. And here's the other thing, uh, keep this in mind. Importantly, literally the entire point of a tariff is to increase prices. That's how tariffs work. They are designed to increase prices. That's the whole point of them. So remember, one of the primary stated purposes of tariffs, not just these tariffs that we're seeing now, but overall tariff policy, is to increase domestic manufacturing capacity and create high-paying domestic jobs. Well, the higher prices that the consumer pays, they both create the incentive to onshore the manufacturing and they provide the revenue to fund it. If the consumers are not paying higher prices, then you don't even get the benefits from the tariffs. You get all the cost and none of the benefit. So you have to increase prices. Otherwise, the tariffs never work as intended. I have been asked, are Trump's tariffs legal? The legal authority is very broad, so probably yes, but it's not entirely certain. We have something called the Trade Act of 1974, which gives broad power to the executive branch. Once the U.S. Trade Representative makes certain factual findings about the barriers to trade, the president can determine tariffs. And similarly, with the Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, also gives very broad authority to the executive. You make certain findings and you impose tariffs. This is what's happening here. It appears to be pretty much in compliance with the law. The law, again, is extremely broad, gives a lot of authority to the chief executive. Several lawsuits are already ongoing. It is way too soon to tell whether they have any merit or how it's going to go. And Congress does have the power to fix this through legislation, and there are now movements in Congress to do that, bipartisan movements in Congress to introduce legislation. There's bipartisan support. The question here, though, is any legislation Congress passes to remove that presidential authority has to be signed by the president. It only becomes law after it's passed by Congress and signed by the president. So if President Trump vetoes the legislation, that means Congress will need a supermajority to override it. So the question here is, do we have support, bipartisan support from 2/3 of both houses of Congress? Not yet, though maybe in the future, if the impact from the tariffs gets sufficiently severe. Again, way too soon to know what's going to happen there. I would like to actually talk about the literal calculation that we're using here. So everybody seems to be wondering how the Trump administration's calculated these new tariffs. How were they calculated? This was the big question when they came out. We had a long list of numbers that appeared to be somewhat arbitrary, and you know, didn't look like the numbers made any sense. So we're going to look at it. We're going to look at the actual tariff calculation so we can understand how this works. And you're about to see why economists and fiscal experts across the spectrum, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, there seems to be wide consensus that these calculations made no sense. And you are about to see why that is. So what you're seeing now, this picture, this is the actual literal formula that the Trump administration used to calculate the tariff percentages last week. Now it looks very fancy. Looks like fancy mathematics, looks complicated. I'm going to show you here that it is neither fancy nor complicated. It actually turns out to be stunningly simple. And here's how we do that. First of all, ignore all those little subscript i's. They're literally meaningless. They have no numerical value, so they do not affect the calculation whatsoever. So you can just ignore those. They don't do anything. You can ignore the delta. It's supposed to indicate a change in rate. It doesn't actually indicate anything of the sort. It was added for looks. Doesn't mean anything. Now the X here uh, indicates a given country's imports from the United States. And the M indicates the country's exports to the United States. That little epsilon and phi, those are meant to represent market elasticity, which is a fancy economic term for how the markets respond to different factors. I'm not going to get into the weeds because it doesn't matter ultimately. They are not actually, variables in this because the administration designated that epsilon would equal 4 and phi would equal 0.25. So they're not variables, they just assign them numbers. The tau on the left indicates a given country's deemed tariff against the United States. I'm putting tariff in quotes there because it isn't actually a tariff in any normal meaning of the word. They're just deeming that a country has a tariff against us equal to that number tau. Now, don't worry, this still seems a little complicated. It's going to simplify much more. You'll see. Now, remember, 0.25 is just 1/4. What happens when you multiply 4 by 1/4? You get 1. And since 1 times anything is just itself, that means 1 times m is just m, and we can completely ignore that. Take it out. It cancels itself out. It doesn't even need to be in the equation. It's just there for looks. Now, up top, when they talk about the country's imports and exports to the United States, what they're really saying is they are deeming this to be the American trade deficit with that given country. I'm putting trade deficit in quotes because that is actually an extremely crude way of calculating trade deficit, but we will just go ahead and take their assumption for now. So, simplifying it, here's what this means. A given country's deemed, quote, tariff against the United States, again, tariff in quotes because it's not actually tariff at all in any meaning of the word. They're just deeming it to be their tariff against the United States. It equals the US trade deficit with that country divided by that country's exports to the United States. So that fancy looking equation, that's all it is. Once you eliminate all of the unnecessary terms and the terms that cancel each other out, this is all that equation is. So put that aside. Then they take that country's deemed, quote, tariff against the United States. They divide it by 2, and that becomes what they are saying is going to be the US tariff rate that we'll impose against that country. Why did they divide it by 2? I don't know. I don't know. They just did. So let's do an example real quick. Let's consider the nation of Madagascar. So that country's deemed tariff against the US, remember, is the US trade deficit with the country divided by the country's exports to the United States. So those are the actual numbers. I went on the US Trade Representative's official website and grabbed the numbers from Madagascar. So our trade deficit with them is 679.8 million, and their exports to the US are 786.6 million. So you just divide those two. That means Madagascar's, quote, deemed tariff on US goods is 86.4%. Again, keep in mind, Madagascar does not impose a tariff of 86.4% on US goods. They just don't. But the administration is saying they're going to deem that to be the tariff they impose. We're pretending it's the tariff they impose. Now remember, we have to divide that by 2, and we come up with 44% because the administration is rounding up. If it's in between, they round it up to the next highest whole number. The new US tariff against Madagascar, according to that formula, is 44%. Now you will see in a moment that they actually imposed a 47% tariff, and I cannot explain that discrepancy because I got my numbers directly from the US Trade Representative's website, so I don't know what they're using for their calculation. Now, also, every country and territory in the world is hit with a minimum 10% tariff, even if the formula comes up with something less. Only Russia and North Korea were excluded. Now, North Korea, we literally import nothing from North Korea, so that's sort of meaningless. But we do trade with Russia. I have my suspicions about why Russia was excluded and not tariffed. And we will later on, towards the end, get to the administration's stated reason for it. Now, here's the thing. It turns out if you ask ChatGPT to produce a formula for a tariff rate that makes trade, quote, fair, this is what it comes up with. It comes up with something very much like this. Now, what does any of this have to do with calculating a rational tariff rate that will achieve its stated objectives? The answer is nothing, as far as I can tell, and that seems to be the consensus again on the right and the left among economists and fiscal experts of all stripes. Has nothing to do with anything. Now, all these tariffs did is they put the highest rates on the countries that have the biggest trade surpluses with the United States, and it did it without regard to that country's actual trade policies, without regard to what sort of goods we exchange, without regard to which country has efficiencies in different area and can produce things better, without regard to whether it helps onshore manufacturing, and without regard to whether it helps protect U.S. workers. In other words, they did not take into account all of the normal things that you would take into account in a rational tariff and trade policy. So consider Madagascar just as an example. As I said, they hit Madagascar with a 47% tariff. As far as I can tell, the formula comes up with 44%. I cannot explain the discrepancy, so I don't know where their numbers are coming from. What do we buy from Madagascar that gives us a trade deficit with them? We buy vanilla and lots of it. Americans love their vanilla. We put it in everything. So we buy a lot of vanilla from Madagascar. So making vanilla 47% more expensive in the US, it does nothing to help American industry or workers. We're not going to onshore suddenly lots more vanilla plantations. We're not going to suddenly put lots of Americans to work growing vanilla in the United States. So it's not at all clear why we want vanilla here to be 47% more expensive. And not just when you buy vanilla beans, but everything you buy that has vanilla in it, which is a lot more than you think, is now going to be more expensive. And it's not at all clear why or what that's helping. We don't grow, well, I meant to say we don't grow enough vanilla in the US, which is why we import it. We do grow some in Florida and Hawaii, but not nearly enough to satisfy Americans' love of vanilla. Now consider Cote d'Ivoire, the tiny West African nation on the coast. Trump hit Cote d'Ivoire with a 21% tariff. What do we buy from Cote d'Ivoire? Primarily cocoa beans. That's our main import there. Making cocoa beans here, we like our cocoa beans in the US too. Making that 21% more expensive, it does nothing to onshore. We're not going to grow lots more cocoa beans in the US. We're not going to suddenly put Americans to work planting and harvesting cocoa beans. They can do that more efficiently in Cote d'Ivoire. So we're going to import it from them because we don't grow enough cocoa beans in the US to satisfy Americans' demands. And now when you buy anything that has cocoa beans as an ingredient, it's about to get more expensive. And it's not at all clear why we're doing that or how it helps anybody. There's nothing unfair happening here. They grow cocoa beans efficiently. We don't, so we buy it from them. It's just that simple. Now, the 10% minimum tariff leads to absurd results. For example, you've probably seen some of these in the media, and these are literally true as far as I can tell. Heard Island and the McDonald Islands, these are Antarctic islands, hit with a 10% tariff. They are uninhabited. There's nobody there. We don't import anything from there. Why are we tariffing those islands? I mean, it's just, I don't know, honestly. Diego Garcia, we hit with a 10% tariff. Diego Garcia is a rock in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Its only inhabitants are US and British military personnel at an Air Force base. It actually turns out to be a very strategic Air Force base, but that's literally all that's there. It doesn't produce anything, doesn't export anything. We don't import anything from them. We don't import anything from any of those islands, and yet we hit them all with a 10% tariff. Why? I don't know. And I haven't heard a sufficient explanation or really any explanation at all from the administration on why we are tariffing islands that don't produce anything and don't export anything. So the American Enterprise Institute, this is a libertarian think tank that does a lot of really great work in economics and fiscal policy. They said the formula for the tariffs does not make economic sense. The trade deficit with a given country is not determined only by tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers, but also by international capital flows, supply chains, comparative advantage, geography, etc. The AEI went on to say, but even if one were to take the Trump administration's tariff formula seriously, it makes an error that inflates the tariffs assumed to be levied by foreign countries fourfold. As a result, the reciprocal tariffs imposed by President Trump are highly inflated as well. So AEI and Cato, which is another libertarian think tank, they discovered a built-in math error in the formula. I'm not going to go back and explain it and point it out because it doesn't matter anyway. But there was inside that formula, inside one of the terms, was a built-in math error that AEI and Cato discovered. And that math error means that the new tariffs we're imposing on countries are 4 times higher than they should be, even if you assume that that formula's assumptions are correct. This is from Justin Wolfer, professor of economics at the University of Michigan. Monstrously destructive, incoherent, ill-informed tariffs based on fabrications, imagined wrongs, discredited theories, and ignorance of decades of evidence. And the real tragedy is that they will hurt working Americans more than anyone else. From Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize winner in economics, the tariffs Trump announced were higher than almost anyone expected. This is a much bigger shock to the economy than the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which, as a side note, is credited for driving us deeper into the Great Depression, especially when you bear in mind that international trade is about 3 times as important now as it was then. Still from Paul Krugman, the size of the tariffs, however, wasn't the only shocking thing about the Rose Garden announcement. Arguably, what we learned about how the Trump team arrived at those tariff rates, the sheer malignant stupidity of the whole thing, was even worse. Now, I'm going to play a clip from Ben Shapiro. He is a conservative, you might even say right wing political commentator and podcaster. This is a Trump supporter. He's been pretty MAGA and Trump supporting. He so some of my progressive friends, I know you don't like him very much. That's fine. He had an excellent, just because you don't like somebody doesn't mean they're wrong all the time. He had an excellent, succinct explanation of what's going on with these tariffs. And I think I actually screwed up my share so that hang on a second. So the sound might not work. So I might have to do oh, hey Norma, how you doing?
Good.
Good. Here, let me reshare real quick. All right, so hopefully we can all hear what Ben is saying here.
Tariffs impose hundreds of billions of dollars in new taxes on Americans, be the largest tax increase since the Revenue Act of 1968. One of the biggest tax increases on American consumers in the history of America. And it's going to cost American consumers. It will cost American producers who use inputs from other countries. Trade wars are, in fact, not good and not easy to win, particularly if you don't actually have a plan. It is predicated on a bad idea of how international trade works. A fundamental misunderstanding of trade deficits. Trade deficits they're an accounting procedure. Trade deficits have pretty much nothing to do with the health of an economy. I can name you a period in American history where there was a fairly large surplus in America's balance of trade. The entire Great Depression.
So there you go. And I completely agree with him. We're gonna see this in a few minutes. There's nothing good or bad about trade deficits. They are literally just an accounting ledger entry. That's it. So in a moment, we're going to discuss the stated objectives of the Trump tariffs, why these tariffs are poorly designed to achieve those objectives, and what I think perhaps the real objectives are. So before we get to that, does anybody who's here on Zoom or on Facebook have any questions? I do see somebody just texted me one question who's watching. Um, are we losing money when there are trade deficits? The answer is no, and we're going to explain why that is. We are not, when there's a trade deficit, does not mean we're losing money. Again, it's just an accounting entry. Does anybody else have any questions for now? If not, we can keep going. I'm gonna keep drinking again. As I said up front, I have a long day of talking on calls and videos and everything, so my nice ginger tea is gonna keep my voice going today. All right, so the stated objectives of the Trump tariffs, there are, as far as I can tell, there are four stated objectives, meaning the administration, when asked, why are you doing the tariffs, these are the four answers we get. The first is to make trading fair. Second, it's a negotiating tactic. Third, they say it's to raise revenue. And fourth, they will say it's to onshore manufacturing slash reindustrialize the American economy. So these are the reasons, the objectives they are giving for why they imposed these tariffs last week. So let's talk about making international trade more fair. So we have all heard the president repeatedly say that other countries are treating us unfairly. He'll even say they're screwing us, they're stealing from us, we're losing money, things like that. Now, as far as I can tell, the president seems to genuinely believe that trade deficits are some sort of unqualified bad and evidence of unfair trade practices. I think he genuinely believes that. But I want to be clear from an economics and fiscal policy perspective, trade deficits are not good or bad. Trade surpluses are not good or bad. They are simply the result of the differing nature of the products and services and capital in each country. And they are just nothing more than one entry on a much larger accounting ledger. We call this accounting ledger the balance of payments, and it contains a lot of items. And the balance of payments ledger, trade deficits are just one small piece of that much larger accounting ledger that nations keep between themselves. This is a simple diagram of what the balance of payments ledger looks like. And where are the trade deficits on there? It's just one piece over there on the left side. The balance of trade, that's your trade deficit or your trade surplus with a given country or overall. So that's where your trade deficit or trade surplus is down there in the balance of trade. As you can see, the balance of payments is the entire ledger, and that's just one piece of it. Now, Donald Trump, this is hot off the presses. He said this just last night. We have massive financial deficits with China, the European Union, and many others. The only way this problem can be cured is with tariffs, which are now bringing tens of billions of dollars into the USA. Now, to be clear, we do not have financial deficits with these countries. We have trade deficits. Again, go back to the balance of payments ledger. When you have a trade deficit over on the left, it is offset by extra capital over on the right. We are not losing money. There is no financial deficit. It all balances out just like any other accounting ledger does. It does not mean we are losing wealth or losing money or anything. In fact, a trade deficit means you have on the left side, means you have a surplus of capital on the right side, which means money is coming in from the trade deficit. And when he says these tariffs are already bringing billions of dollars into the US, that's not how tariffs work. They don't bring money into the country. They tax the people who are already here. They tax us. It does not bring new money in. I think there is a genuine misunderstanding on the president's part of what tariffs are and what trade deficits are and how it all works. Go back to Madagascar, for example. We talked about Madagascar earlier. Madagascar grows lots of vanilla. We grow much less. We grow some in Florida and Hawaii, but the quality is not as good, and we don't grow nearly enough to satisfy Americans' demand for vanilla. So we import it. Again, Americans, we love our vanilla. It's in lots of things. And the United States, what do we produce here? We produce refined industrial goods that Madagascar cannot produce. Things like machinery and plastics and pharmaceuticals. So Madagascar imports that from us because they cannot produce it where they are. Again, Americans, we love our vanilla. It is a key component in our food supply chain, so we import a lot of it. Now, Madagascar does import the refined goods from us, but they are a poor country. So the value of the expensive refined goods it imports from us are limited. It can't afford to import from us as much as we import from them. So we have a trade deficit with Madagascar. We import more from them than they import from us. Does that mean Madagascar is doing anything unfair? They're not doing anything unfair. They're sending us lots of vanilla because we want vanilla. That's it. It's as simple as that. They can produce more vanilla more efficiently than we can, so they send us a lot. So who's getting hurt by this 47% tariff on Madagascar? American food companies that use vanilla in their products, American consumers who consume vanilla. We're all going to pay more for vanilla now, and possibly the vanilla farmers in Madagascar. That's who's getting hurt. But it's not going to change Madagascar's trade policies. There's not really much to change. What are we going to stop buying vanilla from them? That, we'd have to stop buying vanilla, I guess, and maybe we will. But Madagascar's trade policies, there's nothing wrong with their trade policies. They're just sending us what we want to buy from them. The second reason we hear from the administration is that these tariffs are just a negotiating tactic. That's one of their justifications. We know this. There are a number of quotes that which confirm this, but I'll just do a couple. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, I think we should make it very clear that there is a green, a yellow, and a red bucket, and we let everyone know where they are. Now, this is a callback to an old economic term. I'm not going to go into the history there, but what he's basically saying is that we're going to have favored countries and neutral countries and disfavored countries. And that if you make a deal, you can move from the red bucket to the yellow bucket to the green bucket. And Eric Trump, the president's son, I wouldn't want to be the last country that tries to negotiate a trade deal with Donald Trump. Again, indicating not only is this a negotiating tactic, but in a sense, a threat. The first people that make the deal will get the better deal, and the last people will get worse deals. That's what they're saying there. Now, that to me sounds much more like a protection racket than a sound trade policy. It's like a mob boss who arrives in a new neighborhood demanding money for protection, and the first shopkeeper to pay up gets the best deal, and the last shopkeeper gets the worst deal. That's how they're treating this. Here's why it's not going to work as a negotiating tactic, and we're already seeing that it's not working. First, foreign nations are not shopkeepers with no power. They are sovereign entities. They have their own economic and political imperatives, completely independent from us. Sovereign nations know that if you make a deal with the bully just keeps coming back for more. If you give the bully your milk money, he's going to come for more milk money tomorrow. Also, Trump has already made trade deals with these nations, and by imposing the tariffs, that means he's reneged on those previous deals. So they don't trust him to make a new deal. They made deals with him before, and he has now reneged on those deals. So they are not inclined to make new deals. They don't trust that he will keep his word. And some nations simply can't make a deal. There's no deal to be made. What sort of deal is Madagascar supposed to make? They're sending us vanilla because we want vanilla. It's just that simple. I don't understand what deal they're supposed to make. So here's what's actually happening instead of people making deals with us, right? So we have the United States, we have our North American trading partners, we have our Asian allies, we have China, an Asian adversary, but a key trading partner. We have our European allies, and we do a lot of trade with Africa. So right now, the United States is the hub of world trade, or at least until a week ago, we were the hub of world trade, right? So much comes to us, from us, through us, by us. We're sort of the center of the world economic and trading system. Now, of course, all those other countries trade with each other as well, but the United States has been the hub of the world trading system for a while now, 80 years basically. Here's what's now happening. Instead of making deals, those countries are going to be trading less with us. They're already imposing their own tariffs and trade barriers in response to all this, and they're going to trade a lot more with each other. They've already said they're going to do this. So instead of making deals with us, they are just creating a new world system that bypasses us and goes around us. And keep this in mind when we talk about this as a potential negotiating tactic. We already know The negotiating tactic is not working because the other nations are slapping us with large retaliatory tariffs of their own. When you say it's a negotiating tactic, what you are signaling is that the tariff regime is unstable. You're saying, I'm willing to negotiate, I'm willing to change it. So there's no stability. And when you admit out loud that the tariffs are a negotiating tactic, then you've already given up your bargaining power. When you say this is just a negotiating tactic, that means you are giving away your bargaining power and it doesn't work as a negotiating tactic anymore. Think of it like this. Let's say a robber comes up in the alley, puts a gun to your head. He says, give me your wallet or else. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, I better give the guy my wallet. I don't want to get shot. And then he says, hey, but don't worry, this is just a negotiating tactic. Oh, well, then he's just given up all his power. Oh, so you're not going to shoot me. So I don't have to give you my wallet. When you admit something is a negotiating tactic, it no longer works as a negotiating tactic because you've given up your power. The third justification we are seeing is raising revenue. So the administration says the tariffs are going to raise revenue so that we can either pay off the deficit and or allow for tax cuts in other areas. Now, first, it is true that tariffs will raise revenue. Tariffs can and do raise revenue. That's literally what they do. But these tariffs are poorly designed as revenue raisers. So the amount is uncertain. Raising revenue through tariffs requires a tariff regime that is rationally calculated and stable over the long run. And we've already talked about the irrational nature of the calculations that don't take into account all the normal things you're supposed to take into account when you raise revenues through tariffs. And we already know these are unstable because the administration has admitted out loud that they might simply change them based on negotiations. And the next administration could just simply, with a swipe of a pen, repeal them altogether. So if they're irrational and unstable, they don't really work as a revenue raiser. The final, or at least for now, the fourth stated objective from the administration of these tariffs is reindustrialization. The president says the tariffs are going to reindustrialize the US economy by incentivizing more investment in domestic manufacturing. Now, I think this is a very worthy goal myself. I completely agree with this goal. This is one thing where I agree with the administration. US industrial capacity has declined massively over the last 30 years, and it's resulted in huge economic devastation around large parts of the country. There are swaths of the country that are economically devastated because we have deindustrialized. We put a lot of people out of work. We eliminated a lot of good paying jobs and sent them offshore. So I'm all for reindustrializing the United States economy. I personally support that. If we rebuild US industry, we can create a lot of good paying jobs. We can build a lot of wealth domestically. It makes us less dependent on foreign nations' industry. And in the coming conflict in Asia, it helps us compete militarily with China. So I'm all for rebuilding US industry. Completely agree with that goal. And under the right circumstances, tariffs can be one component of helping us rebuild domestic industry, right? One component of it, if you do them right. But these tariffs are not going to do that. Here's why. So a tariff that can be one component of rebuilding domestic industry, it needs to be targeted at specific types of industrial goods. It needs to be targeted at specific adversary nations. It needs to be low enough to impose costs, but not so high as to trigger retaliation that makes American business uncompetitive. And this perhaps most importantly, it has to be stable and predictable over the long run. Now, as we've already seen, these tariffs are not targeted at specific types of industrial goods. They're just imposed on everything. The only exceptions being a handful of minerals and ores that we import. They are not targeted at specific nations. They are just imposed across the board, including on allies, including on countries that are doing nothing wrong, including on uninhabited islands. These tariffs were so high and such a shock, they triggered immediate retaliation that already is going to make American goods uncompetitive abroad. So we can reindustrialize and build all this stuff, but we won't be able to sell it. And we've already seen they are neither stable nor predictable. In fact, the administration has basically admitted that their own tariffs are not stable or predictable. So they've done the opposite of what you would normally do if you want tariffs that are one component of a reindustrialization policy. They are, at this point, placing a burden on heavily integrated supply chains that cannot simply be untangled. Our supply chains are not entirely domestic. They're highly integrated. We have parts that go back and forth across the border many times before they're put into the finished and refined good. You can't just untangle those overnight. They have angered our allies and made their populations not want to buy US goods. In fact, our allies' populations, you've probably seen the news out of Canada, for example, they don't want to buy American products anymore because they're pissed about this. We've seen that we are redirecting global trade to go around the US and bypass the US instead of through it like we had before. And they're reducing capital flow into the US. We have foreign countries already saying that they are discouraging investment in the United States because we are no longer seen as a reliable or safe place to invest. So the capital we need to come in to fund all of this is now not coming in. All of that has the effect of making American industry less competitive around the world, not more competitive. So it's completely counterproductive. And they're actually disincentivizing companies from investing in new manufacturing rather than providing the incentives to build. So it's having the exact opposite effect of what they're saying they want. Consider a company like, let's say, Ford Motor Company, right? They build automobiles in the US and Canada. Their supply chain is heavily integrated with Canada and Mexico, meaning the parts cross the borders many times before they are assembled into an automobile. And every time the part crosses the border, it's subject to the tariff all over again. So if the stated purpose of the tariffs is to incentivize a company like Ford to build more manufacturing in the US, it's not going to work. That's my spoiler alert. Ford is not going to build these new factories. Look at it this way, right? Let's say we want Ford to build a new factory, maybe an assembly plant, maybe a plant to build the parts for the cars so they don't have to source the parts in Canada or Mexico anymore. They have a number of problems in building this new factory. Environmental review provides years of delay before you can even break ground on the factory. These factories are not going to be operational. Even if Ford starts today, it's not going to be operational next year. It'll take them 2 or 3 years before they can even break ground and start building. And the tariffs do nothing to address that. Zoning red tape. Local governments get very uppity and picky about where you build your factory. That's more delay. The tariffs do not address that problem. Endless lawsuits. Anymore now, no matter where you build a new factory, nobody wants it in their backyard, so there will be a lawsuit. That's more delay. The tariffs do not address that problem. Financing. It might cost Ford $100 million to build a parts factory. Where do they get that 100 million? It's not like that cash is sitting in the bank. That's not how it works. They have to finance it. And the tariffs, far from helping financing, have suddenly thrown the global markets into turmoil. I just checked this morning for the third trading day in the row. The markets are on free fall. Where does Ford get the money to finance the factory? If you're going to build a factory, you need long-term planning. You have to plan 5 to 10 years in the future just to build the factory, and you have to plan 50 years in the future for the life of the factory and the parts it's going to produce. These tariffs do nothing to help that long-term planning. In fact, the administration has already signaled that they might be unstable. So you can't plan long-term for this. Who's going to work in that factory? Let's say the factory creates 1,000 new high-paying jobs for skilled workers. There is already a shortage of workers in American manufacturing plants. They have job openings they can't fill. So where do they find the extra people to work in this factory? The tariffs do nothing to address that problem. And the customers simply aren't going to support the increased costs. Again, the only way they're going to fund this new factory, if you want to onshore, they have to raise prices for the customers. The customers are only going to support paying so much for a new car. So there's no money. So again, spoiler alert, Ford is not building the new factory. Let's think about a t-shirt company, right? Let's say they buy t-shirts from Bangladesh and they sell those t-shirts to retailers in the US. They could instead buy t-shirts from a factory in West Virginia. Well, the stated purpose in a case like this of the tariffs is to incentivize this company to start buying t-shirts from West Virginia and not buy them from Bangladesh anymore. Again, another spoiler alert, they're not going to buy the t-shirts from West Virginia. Let's look at why. Let's say we have the All American T-shirt company. They sell super awesome patriotic T-shirts. Everybody loves them. Great T-shirts, right? We all want one. They could buy those T-shirts from a factory in Bangladesh, or they could buy those T-shirts from a factory in West Virginia. I actually looked up the numbers on this. When they buy the T-shirt from Bangladesh, it costs them $2.15 on the high end. I'm doing the high end here. Costs them $2.15 on the high end to buy the T-shirt from Bangladesh. And that includes shipping cost across the ocean. That's their end cost for it. If they buy a T-shirt from West Virginia, it costs $15 per shirt on the low end. Guess where they're buying their T-shirts? Not a hard question. They're buying the T-shirts from Bangladesh. And you say, okay, but now we have tariffs on Bangladesh. We do. So after the 37% tariff on Bangladesh, the T-shirts from Bangladesh are now $2.95. Still compared to $15 for the same T-shirt from West Virginia. Guess where they are still buying their T-shirts from? It ain't West Virginia. It has not onshored anything. So these tariffs completely fail at even the stated purpose that I support. So we've had some interesting quotes out of the administration on the Sunday talk shows yesterday. So our Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, he was asked on the talk show what kinds of jobs are going to be onshored. And I'm going to give you his answer word for word. You're going to think this is a parody and a joke. It is not. This is literally what he said on a Sunday talk show. The army of millions of human beings screwing in little screws on iPhones, that kind of thing is going to come to America. That was his answer to what kind of jobs we're going to onshore. He thinks we're going to have millions of Americans screwing in little screws on iPhones now. That's the sort of job he wants to come onshore. Again, spoiler alert, that's not going to happen. Even that won't happen. That is not especially desirable outcome, and even that is not going to happen. We're still going to keep paying people abroad to screw in those little screws. Our Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, she was asked to explain why we put tariffs on uninhabited islands. You are going to think this is a parody or a joke. It is not. This is her actual answer. It was the most stumbling, bumbling answer I've seen from a high-ranking official in a long time. Well, I mean that, come on, obviously, we live under a tariff regime from other countries. The idea that America goes first, I mean, come on, whatever. That was her answer to why we are putting tariffs on uninhabited islands. I'm not joking you. That was the answer, the actual answer to the question. Now, Kevin Hansett, he's the director of the National Economic Council. So yesterday on the shows, he was asked why we exempted Russia. Why is Russia literally the only trading partner in the entire world who was not hit with tariffs? This was his answer. You don't put new things on the table when in the middle of a negotiation that affects so many American, Ukrainian, and Russian lives. Now, at first glance, this is by far the most rational and substantive answer I saw from any of the administration officials yesterday. This one seems to make a little bit of sense, so I'll give them some credit here. On the other hand, we put tariffs on Ukraine in the middle of the same negotiation. We put a new thing on the table with them. We put new tariffs on China, and we were in the middle of negotiating with China on all kinds of things, not least of which is having them not steal our intellectual property anymore. We put something new on the table there. We're negotiating with several Middle East countries right now in issues. We put new things on the table there. So again, why did Russia get the special treatment? So it's hard to know what the real purpose is. Again, people are like, okay, Ian, so if none of their stated purposes actually work, what's the real purpose? I don't really know. I can't get inside the heads of the people in the administration. I can make some educated guesses. First, I think President Trump really thinks trade deficits are bad. I think that is based on an utter total misunderstanding of what trade deficits are and how they work and how we come up with them and what they mean. But I think he thinks they are bad. I think the president really does think tariffs are beautiful. He keeps saying so. Maybe we should take him at his word. Maybe he thinks tariffs are beautiful. I think it's a way to hold other countries hostage. They've basically admitted this out loud by saying that the countries that come in to make the first deal are going to get the best deal. And I think it's a way to hold domestic companies hostage. One little known provision in these tariff laws is the president has the power to exempt specific companies and products from the tariffs. So Ford Motor Company, as I said, they're not going to go build a new factory for all the reasons we talked about. They're just not. So that fails in that purpose. But Ford Motor Company could go to Trump and offer him some sort of concession. I don't know what that might be, but they could promise to work with Trump on something that's important to him. They could offer him some sort of concession, and he could then exempt the parts they import from the tariffs. So it's a way to hold domestic companies hostage. In other words, it does start to kind of look like a protection racket, quite frankly. Uh, Otherwise, maybe there are other reasons that are unstated that they haven't talked about. I simply don't know. I have no way of knowing. But that's the tariff stuff. Does anybody on Facebook or who's here live have any questions about any of that? I know we really got into the weeds, lots of economics and finance. But again, I want to do this today because it's the single biggest subject I'm getting questions about. Norma, hey, great to see you.
Hey, yeah, thanks. Well, as I listen to you beautifully lay this out, this government is putting us in a state of treason and danger with other countries, and maybe we need that. So us, the people, start standing up and taking our power back. I don't know, or get rid of him. Uh,
Well,
because
I'm all for the people taking their power back, and I think we should, regardless of whether we have Republicans or Democrats in government, we are giving away our power as people. The whole point of our Constitution is the people are supposed to have the power, right?
yeah.
Not the people at the top. That's the entire point of our system of government is the power lies with the people, and we've given it away over the last 100 years.
Yeah, and they reflect, the top reflects the bottom
Yeah.
reflects the top.
Yep.
So you're right on target with what you said. Maybe we're all supposed to wake up.
Yep. Yeah, we're all supposed to wake up. And I talk about the other day too in one of my daily updates when, we're all demanding that people wake up. And then sometimes then when people do wake up, we get mad at them because we like to say, I told you so, or you should have known better. But if you're going to demand that people wake up, you then have to like move over and make room for them. You can't get mad at them, right? Otherwise, they'll just go back to sleep.
Yeah,
If you want people to get off one train and get on your train, then move over and let them have a seat.
nice.
If you don't give them grace, look, we've all needed grace in our lives when we've changed our minds before, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's one more question. When Joe Biden was president,
Hmm.
he used this thing called Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, something like that.
Hmm.
And he instilled tariffs on countries, some that took place in 2024, some to take place in
Hmm.
2025 and 2026. So, what maybe I don't, I wonder if Trump and whoever he works with even consider those.
I don't know. So the thing is, I'm not completely opposed to tariffs in concept, right? I think tariffs are a very useful tool if they are one component of a larger rational trade policy. Like for example, we are currently in a brewing Cold War with China that Cold War might turn hot in the next few years if China invades Taiwan, which means we have to have our own domestic defense industry that can build things without parts from China, right? We can't be using parts from China to build our tanks and airplanes and drones. We just can't. So I would be all for, and in fact, this is what Biden was doing. He had targeted tariffs on China's industry, especially on their computer chips and some of their high-tech parts. So we had targeted tariffs on specific foreign adversaries in order to make sure that our own domestic manufacturing was independent of that and did not rely on them just in case it does come to war. Nobody wants the war. Nobody wants the war. But if it does come to that, you want to win the war. You don't want to lose a war. You want to win the war. And so targeted tariffs as part of a larger policy are extremely useful. We could have targeted tariffs on certain auto parts to try and incentivize domestic manufacturing of those auto parts and create good jobs here. If you do it as part of another, again, a larger regime where we have other tax incentives and things at home. So I'm not completely opposed to tariffs as, altogether. Some tariffs are useful if you think it through. The problem with these tariffs, if we had posted on everything and everybody everywhere without regard to, like, again, people talk about, I've been told Madagascar is an extreme example. It is an extreme example, but it's a very informative example. Why are we putting tariffs on vanilla from Madagascar? What
Yeah.
what is the point? Why did we just make everything, all of our food with vanilla in it in the United States is about to get very expensive all of a sudden? For what? I,
Yeah, it's not logical. I'm sorry.
yeah,
There's no logic in any of this.
no.
Or they have a secret agenda that nobody knows about.
Well, it's like I said at the end, I think it's one of the real reasons that they don't want to say out loud is it gives them power to extract concessions from American companies, right? So speaking of vanilla, you could have a company that makes, vanilla syrup or something, and they don't want to have to raise prices on their vanilla syrup. So they go make some deal with the administration on some other subject, and then they get a break on their vanilla. That's that could be, again, I don't know. I can't
Yeah,
get inside their
yeah.
heads, right? I have no
Well,
idea.
if that is the way they're going, it's a downward trend. I'm
Well, right,
sorry.
because when they do it, then the next administration will do it, and the next administration, and right, it just becomes the new normal for what
Yeah, well, there's
happens.
no integrity. So when you don't have
Right.
integrity, God help all of us.
Yeah.
Well, we can
Um,
hold high thoughts.
yeah. I do want to address a handful of questions that people emailed me on some other subjects real quick.
Okay.
Um, so one of them, I got a question. What effect does the SCOTUS immunity decision have on what we're seeing now? So last summer, the Supreme Court determined that presidents are functionally immune from criminal prosecution, even when they break the law. I haven't seen a huge effect on that now. Nothing. I mean, the administration is doing things that violate established laws, like they're ignoring court orders and stuff, but they are not, there's no criminal activity. The president hasn't committed any crimes as far as I know. So far, we'll see, we'll see what happens. Um, that another question on that judicial election in Wisconsin last week. So Elon Musk had showed up and he was handing out $1 million checks to people if they voted. The question is, was that legal? Um, it's not totally clear. I think it's probably not legal. There are laws against paying people to vote. And then he tried to characterize it as a lottery, but it also broke the lottery laws because you have to register your lottery. But it doesn't really matter at this point. Um, I got another question emailed. Does the Border Patrol have the right to search my phone? So yes, is the answer. When you come into the United States, the Border Patrol has a right to search anything they want, including going through your phone and everything if they want to. The you have the most rights if you're a U.S. citizen in the United States within the borders. But all of us, whether we're citizens or not, we have the fewest rights when we are entering the country. When on the act of entering the country, when you're coming back from vacation in Mexico or Europe, you're going through customs. That's when you have the fewest rights. They do have the right to search anything they want. And yes, U.S. citizens have not been turned away because of what's on their phone, but like foreign tourists have. Like there have been foreign tourists coming here on vacation. Their phones were searched, and if they are found to have anti-Trump content, they were told to go home. So they do have that right. So those are some of the questions that I've seen. Um, oh, I just got another question texted to me. How soon are we going to see price increases from the tariffs? So here's the thing, very quickly. You might think, well, it takes a while for these tariffs to trickle through the supply chain. And in a sense, that's true, right? So let's say a company, you have an importer who's bringing vanilla in today from Madagascar. So the vanilla gets here on the plane. As soon as it goes through customs, the import company has to pay that tariff immediately on the vanilla. But then they have to pass it on to the wholesaler, the manufacturer, the retailer. So it does take a while for that to trickle through. But what you're going to see is anticipatory price increases because these companies are already thinking, how am I going to pay for those tariffs? They don't just have the extra cash lying around to do that. They operate on very low margins per each vanilla bean that comes in. So you're going to see the price increases pretty much right away on this. So those are the questions I've got. I can double check Facebook just in case anything else came in that I didn't see. All right. Yeah, doesn't look like it. Very good. So thanks so much, everyone. That's our Trump tariff talk and our AMA for today. Appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. We will also upload this recording on YouTube very quickly now for those who want to see it. So thanks so much, everyone. I'll see you soon. Bye.